This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 532 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. Fantasy football draft season is here. It's been here for months for a lot of crazies out there, but the majority of you have your big home league drafts this month. Throughout the offseason, I've looked at different approaches you can take to enhance your odds of winning a fantasy football championship. I looked at things like the impact rookie quarterbacks and mobile quarterbacks have on their pass catchers. I did all those episodes last month on breakout players. I looked at how the quarterback landscape is changing. We did a lot of strategy-related stuff this offseason, and hopefully those episodes and those studies helped you look at the game a little bit differently. And hopefully you're a better drafter this year because of them. But I get it. Especially this time of year, you want some player takes. You want me to tell you who I'm drafting and why I'm drafting them. So that's what today's all about. When I did this episode on players to target the last few years, I made sure to cover players of all ADPs and of all positions. I took a slightly different approach this year. Instead of forcing some arbitrary parameters of wanting this mix of early and super late round guys, I just straight up asked myself, JJ, who are you really targeting this year? Which players seem to have the right balance of value and upside in fantasy football this season? When I asked that question, I couldn't pinpoint a tight end or two who seemed obvious. I like Kelsey and Waller this year. I like Pitts, Hockenson, and Andrews. And then I like a lot of late round dart throws like Adam Troutman, Irv Smith, Gerald Everett, and even Donald Parham as a super late round dart. So when I wrote an article last week on NumberFire.com on my 10 favorite targets in fantasy drafts, that list didn't include a tight end. Because I don't want to force anything. The 10 players I'm going to talk about today are genuinely, seriously 10 guys I'm looking to draft in pretty much any format. And today I'll talk through each one and I'll explain why I like them. So hopefully you like it. But before I get into the 10 players to target, hey baseball fans, FanDuel is giving you an exclusive way to get in on the action with the MLB Single Entry Series presented by RotoGrinders. Each week, enter a featured single entry series contest to win cash and compete for a seat in the $40,000 online final. Just play daily and FanDuel will add your 4 highest point totals together to get your combined score and rank for the week. Head over to FanDuel and enter the MLB Single Entry Series today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. Let's kick things off with Russell Wilson. During the first 9 games in 2019, Wilson was averaging close to 25 standard fantasy points per game. That was the most in the NFL. Through the rest of the season, that number fell to 14.9. He was no better than a waiver wire quarterback. Now fast forward a year, 2020, and it was deja vu. From weeks 1 through 8 last year, Russell Wilson was scoring 29.4 points per game. He was the QB1 once again in fantasy football. After week 8, that average fell to just a little over 17 points. Maybe this is simple variance, but maybe it's not, because there's been a lot of talk around Brian Schottenheimer's offense being boring and predictable. Maybe that led to defenses figuring out what was going on with Russell Wilson and that offense. But even if that's not the reason, we have a change in offensive coordinator. Brian Schottenheimer is no longer the offensive coordinator in Seattle. Shane Waldron is. He's coming over from the Rams. And during his 3 years as passing coordinator there, he sometimes called plays with Sean McVay. And LA was more pass heavy than what we've seen from Seattle over the last 3 years. In terms of overall pass rate, Seattle is ranked 14th, 28th, and 32nd over the last 3 seasons. LA has been 21st, 7th, and 21st. But here's the thing. When you look at that in terms of neutral script ratio or what's going on when games are close, it favors the Rams even more. Over the last 3 years, last year Seattle was 9th in neutral script pass rate, and then they were 31st and 32nd. The Rams have been 15th, 9th, and 15th over the last 3 years. They've consistently been more pass heavy. Now we'll see if the Seahawks actually move towards a more pass heavy and pass friendly scheme. The reason I'm bringing that data up is because of thinking about what's possible. Guys, Russell Wilson has played just 16 games in his entire career where he's hit 40 pass attempts. Since 2011, that 16 number, that ranks 27th highest in the NFL. Just to give you an idea, Blake Bortles has more 40-plus attempt games than Russell Wilson does. And so does Waldron's ex-quarterback Jared Goff. In those games with 40 or more pass attempts, though, Russell Wilson's averaged 26.4 fantasy points per game. Of all the quarterbacks since 2011 who have 10 or more of those types of games, the only player with a higher points per game average is Patrick Mahomes. The obvious allure with Russell Wilson this year is what happens if this scheme does move favorably towards the pass. Even just a little bit. Because at worst, you're getting a player who's simply going to meet expectation. You're drafting Russell Wilson as the QB6. Chances are he's going to be a top 10 quarterback even if they don't increase their volume numbers through the air. Or at least he's going to be close. But just a small tweak to this offense can take Russell Wilson to the moon. Now, like Russell Wilson, Ryan Tannehill has done very well in fantasy football despite being in a low passing volume offense. Since taking over as a Titans starter in 2019, Tannehill's averaged 21.7 fantasy points per game. Here are the quarterbacks who are averaging more points per game than Ryan Tannehill over this time: Lamar Jackson, Dak Prescott, Patrick Mahomes, Josh Allen, Justin Herbert, and Aaron Rodgers. That's it. And yes, you heard that correctly. Ryan Tannehill, since he's become starter, he's averaged more points per game than Russell Wilson. And this is all happening in an offense that's been really, really run heavy. In 2019, the Titans were 29th in overall pass to rush attempt ratio, and that was 30th last year. Now, I will say, Ryan Tannehill likely won't be as efficient as he's been over the last year and a half. It's going to be really hard to maintain that efficiency. He's been the best quarterback in the league in adjusted yards per attempt since becoming starter. He's been better than Patrick Mahomes within that statistic. And his touchdown rate has been above 7%. Again, it's very hard to maintain that. But just like Russell Wilson, there's a chance that we see more volume through the air in this Tennessee offense. Not only is the defense a little bit questionable, but as we know, they just got Julio Jones. Ryan Tannehill now gets to throw to A.J. Brown, one of the most talented and best young wide receivers in the league, and Julio Jones. And let's not forget about Ryan Tannehill's rushing. He's likely going to be a fringe top 10 quarterback in rushing yards this year. But over the last 2 seasons, he's found the end zone 11 times on the ground. And more potential passing, that brings more scrambles too. That's pretty attractive. So Tannehill's situation is pretty similar to Russell Wilson's. With Tannehill, you're getting another player, who won't have that much trouble meeting expectation. Now, we want more than that, especially at the quarterback position. But I would argue that not all quarterbacks have such obvious growth potential as Ryan Tannehill does. And that growth being what could happen in the volume department. So I think Ryan Tannehill is a very good pick this year. Now, the next player I want to talk about, it's actually 2 players. It's a twofer. If you're not able to get a top tier quarterback this year, if they don't fall in drafts, because I like going after those guys if they fall, and then you can't get Russell Wilson, and then you can't get Ryan Tannehill, I like going after the rookie quarterbacks, specifically Trey Lance and Justin Fields. Because as we know, they could be difference makers with their legs. I talked about this all offseason. I talked about it last season. But the fantasy football world has become sharper. Drafters now recognize the importance of rushing at the quarterback position. I mean, Tom Brady, a quintessential pocket passer, he had the 3rd highest touchdown rate of his career last year. He threw 40 touchdown passes. And guess what? He was the QB 11 in points per game. Why do you think that happened? Why wasn't he ranked higher? Because the quarterbacks who were ranked ahead of him, they were doing a lot on the ground. From 2011 through 2018, if you look at top 12 quarterbacks and how they scored their points, in no season did the percentage of points from rushing exceed 15.1%. Over the last 2 years, that number's been 18.9% and 18.2%. To put that another way, top 12 quarterbacks are seeing a larger majority of their points come from the ground than what we've seen historically. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that mobile quarterbacks are no longer being held back as passers. We have dual threat quarterbacks who are also good through the air. So this is where Justin Fields and Trey Lance come into play. Now, as of today, we don't know when either quarterback is going to start for their team. It might not even happen this year. Who knows? But I'm going to bet, because of what's happened historically, that they're on the field sooner rather than later. We see it all the time. We think quarterbacks are going to not play for their entire rookie season, and then they're under center week 6. And with Justin Fields, you're getting a quarterback who faced a really tough college schedule and thrived. He did really well. And then on top of that, he has the athleticism. The dude at his pro day ran a 4.44 40. And Trey Lance, he's evidently lighting up 49ers camp. And he has a great college rushing resume. He's also got a great coaching staff and good personnel around him. Oh, and by the way, the 49ers, like I said last week, they have the easiest schedule in the league this year. That's when looking at win totals provided by FanDuel Sportsbook. I just think there aren't many obvious late round quarterbacks this year who can do so much with their legs. And we know how important that is in fantasy football right now. Both Trey Lance and Justin Fields, they present that upside. I really do think this could be the year of the rookie quarterback. Now look, it's really tough for first round picks or borderline first round picks to be values. But I think Aaron Jones is undervalued right now. The fear that you have in drafting any Green Bay Packer this year is regression. They scored 64 touchdowns last year. Teams that score that many touchdowns, teams that do that well, they tend to see a pretty significant drop the next year. Since 2011, there have been 37 teams that hit 50 total touchdowns in a season. Of those 37, 29 have next season data, because 8 teams were able to hit that mark last year during that offensive explosion. Among those 29 teams with 50 or more touchdowns, only 3 of them were able to improve their touchdown total the following season. The average drop in touchdowns was 11. Now, this may seem like a bad thing for Aaron Jones, but you have to look at how the Packers were scoring their touchdowns. Aaron Rodgers last year ended with the second highest touchdown rate of all time. That alone shows you that a large percentage of touchdowns were coming through the air for the Packers. Their pass to rush touchdown ratio was 3, which is the 3rd highest in the league. That number tends to regress year over year. I talked about that in an episode back in June. So even though the Packers may not score as many touchdowns this year, the way they get their touchdowns should skew more towards the ground. And this is really evident when looking at what happened at the goal line in particular. Aaron Rodgers threw it 30 times from within his opponent's 5-yard line last year. That was the most of any quarterback in 2020. It was the 4th most of any quarterback since 2011. He converted 20 of those 30 passes into scores. That was the most goal line passing touchdowns in a single season in NFL history. Last year was the best Packers offense that Aaron Jones has ever played in. They averaged 6.3 yards per play. During Aaron Jones' 3 previous seasons, the high was 5.8. And the Packers' 64 total touchdowns was 20 more than the team's previous 3-season high. Despite all this, Aaron Jones had just 10 goal line rushes in 14 games. He had 0.7 goal line rushes per game. The previous season, when the Packers weren't nearly as good offensively, that number was 1.1. I mean, Aaron Jones, who's the primary ball carrier in this Green Bay offense, he scored 0.6 rushing touchdowns per game in this offense that posted 64 touchdowns. Regression was always going to hit Aaron Jones after that 2019 season. He was basically scoring a touchdown per game. But considering the Packers did so well offensively in 2020, Aaron Jones could have actually been better in fantasy football. And yeah, I get it. A.J. Dillon is a freak. I ride my Peloton 5 times a week, and his thighs are 4 times the size of mine. But that doesn't mean he's automatically going to take all the goal line work in the Green Bay offense. Aaron Jones has been one of the best goal line backs in the league over the last couple of years. And then on top of that, on top of the fact that we know that Aaron Jones is going to see some goal line looks, and we know he's going to see a lot of work on the ground, he's been consistently in the 13% to 15% range in target share over the last 2 years. He's one of the few running backs in fantasy football with a true RB1 overall ceiling. And he's being drafted near Austin Eckler right now. He has a similar floor as Austin Eckler, but Austin Eckler might not even see goal line work in his own offense. Aaron Jones will. To me, Jones is closer to that Ezekiel Elliott tier than he is the Austin Eckler one. And that's nothing against Austin Eckler. As I wrote in my article, I said, sometimes you just have to cross your fingers and hope for rational coaching. That's what we have to deal with this year with Travis Etienne. And don't get me wrong, I love me some James Robinson. Anyone who listened to this podcast last year, you know that. But let's not pretend that Robinson is on Travis Etienne's level as a prospect. He can't make splash plays the way that Travis Etienne can. He's not the same type of pass catcher. Like, at the very least, Travis Etienne should slip into a pass catching role for the Jaguars right away. Among the backs in the 2021 draft class who were invited to the Combine, which I know the Combine didn't happen, but they still had an invite list, Etienne ranked 3rd in best season reception share. And that was on one of the best teams in the country. I just can't imagine a team drafting a running back in the first round and using him as a satellite back. And yeah, I understand not all first-round running backs see work right away, but the majority of them do. Over the last 10 years, we've seen 14 first-round running backs take the field as rookies. Those players averaged about 206 rush attempts and 47 targets per season during their rookie year. They had an average team rush share of more than 47% and an average target share north of 8%. Those numbers would have ranked 16th and 23rd respectively at the running back position last year. And keep in mind, some of those players were hurt. And aside from draft capital history, average draft position history paints a pretty favorable picture for ETN as well. As we know, or as people who have listened to this podcast over the last month know, the ambiguous RB1 theory applies to Travis Etienne. If you want to hear more about this theory, go back and listen to the episode on breakout running backs. But the ambiguous RB1 theory states that when you're looking for ambiguous backfields to target, you should be attacking middle round team RB1s who have teammates who are also being selected in the middle rounds. Essentially, when we get situations like the one that we have in Jacksonville where two running backs from the same team are being drafted in the middle rounds together, so you have Travis Etienne and James Robinson, the player who's been drafted first has traditionally had a way higher than normal breakout hit rate. That's Travis Etienne. Now, I'm not saying we ignore reports about James Robinson being the RB1 in this offense or running as the RB1. I would expect that to happen at least to start the year. It might happen all year. But Etienne is still going to see some early down work. And he's very clearly the better pass catcher on that team. He's going to be the one catching passes. And considering this Jacksonville team is going to see a lot of negative game scripts, that's a plus. So given all of that, given the prospect he is, the pass catching potential, the negative game scripts, the ambiguous RB1 theory, I think Travis Etienne is a very good pick this year. Let's move to wide receiver and let's talk about Tyler Lockett. He's one of the more polarizing players in fantasy football right now. I think analysts seem to generally like him, but when I talk about Tyler Lockett on Twitter, people come at me and they're like, but inconsistency, he's a bust, he's overrated. People don't like Tyler Lockett. And I understand that to a point. As I mentioned earlier, Russell Wilson was a different quarterback in fantasy from the front half to the back half of the season last year. That impacted Tyler Lockett as well. During weeks 1 through 7, Tyler Lockett was the second best wide receiver in fantasy football. From weeks 8 through 17, he was 37th. And he was very inconsistent. Objectively, math shows that he was inconsistent. I'm not arguing that. And volume was part of the problem a little bit for Tyler Lockett in and out of that split. During the front half of the season, when he was really good, he was averaging 9.7 targets per game. During the back half of the season, that was 7.4. And then on top of that, Russell Wilson's numbers just regressed. In the front half of the 2020 season, Wilson had a touchdown rate of 10.2%. I mean, had he kept that pace throughout the entire season, he was going to break the record. There was no way that was going to happen. But there's also no way that Russell Wilson is going to maintain the touchdown rate that he had during the second half of last year, which was 4.6%. Russell Wilson's career average touchdown rate is 6.2%. He's fallen below that 4.6% mark only twice. So to assume the Seahawks from the second half of 2020 are going to be the Seahawks in 2021, I think that's a little bit foolish. So where does that put us? I'm not arguing that Tyler Lockett is going to be the front half of 2020 Tyler Lockett here in 2021. But what we can do is look at what's more predictive year over year, and that's volume. You know, was Tyler Lockett a really good fantasy asset during the second half of last year? No. He was wide receiver 37, like I just said. Were his peripherals good? Yes. They actually still were good. During the first half of the season, Tyler Lockett was averaging a 26.6% target share per game. You would think because he was so much worse during the second half of the season that target share dropped significantly. It didn't. It was 23%. I will take a 23% target share in a Russell Wilson-led offense all day long. That's what we have to project in fantasy football. That's what we have to care about in fantasy football, is volume. And by the way, during the second half of last year, Tyler Lockett was dealing with a knee injury. He's a lock to be in line for the most or the second most targets in that offense this year. I'll take that to the bank. I think one surprise player on this list is Chase Claypool. And the reason I have him on this list is because of something that I talked about on this show earlier this offseason. What if Chase Claypool is just very special? What if he's a special wide receiver? And we have some evidence that that might be the case. He finished his rookie season last year with 11 total touchdowns. He scored twice on the ground, 9 times through the air. Since the late 90s, let me tell you all the wide receivers who have had at least 10 total touchdowns during their rookie seasons. Ready for this? Calvin Ridley, Tyreek Hill, Odell Beckham, Mike Evans, Mike Williams from Tampa, and Randy Moss. That's pretty good company. And what's most insane about Claypool's ability to find the end zone last year was that he wasn't even playing a full complement of snaps. He played all 16 games, but he was often being swapped with James Washington. That resulted in a 63% snap rate. That was the third best among Steeler wide receivers. It was 67th best across the league. Now, touchdown regression is definitely coming for Chase Claypool. We cannot project another double-digit touchdown season, but volume can help combat that. He'll see more snaps in 2021. He'll be another year in the league. He's not going to be a rookie. And he's going to build off that 16.7% target share that he had last year. And keep in mind the breakout wide receiver stuff that I talked about in July. Breakout wide receivers rarely come from nowhere. They typically had a decent target share the year before they broke out. And quarterback play didn't seem to matter. Ben Roethlisberger's low ADP does not matter for Chase Claypool and his potential breakout. Breakout wide receivers were also part of more ambiguous wide receiver groups. They didn't usually have highly drafted teammates on their team. Now, I will say there was an increase in hit rate when the wide receiver was the top pass catcher drafted from his NFL team by ADP. And Claypool is not that usually because of Deontay Johnson. But the Steelers don't have a clear-cut number one guy for fantasy football according to the market. That makes them ambiguous. And then probably the most important piece, he's a sophomore wide receiver. We've usually seen more substantial breakouts from year two wide receivers than any other year. I don't think Claypool fits the criteria absolutely perfectly, and he's not always being drafted after the 5th round. So he's more of a fringe breakout candidate according to ADP. But there's a lot pointing to him having a great year this year as Pittsburgh's biggest vertical threat. So let's take all that criteria about breakout wide receivers and apply it to Jerry Jeudy. Breakout wide receivers typically don't come from nowhere. Jerry Jeudy secured a 21.2% target share in the Broncos offense last year. Breakout wide receivers don't have to have top quarterbacks throwing them the ball. And as we know, both Denver quarterbacks have low average draft positions. Breakout wide receivers typically come from ambiguous wide receiver situations by ADP. And the Broncos don't have any pass catchers going early in fantasy drafts. Though I should be clear, we do ideally want our wide receivers in the middle rounds to have no other teammate wide receivers being drafted around them. Breakout wide receivers have a higher hit rate when they're the first pass catcher being selected by their NFL team by ADP. And in recent drafts, Jerry Jeudy has catapulted ahead of Courtland Sutton in ADP. And breakout wide receivers see an increased hit rate when they're second-year wide receivers. This is Jerry Jeudy's second year in the league. Jeudy was a top-ranked prospect in a class filled with strong wide receivers. He had a top 25 target share last year as a rookie wide receiver. He finished the 2020 season with the 6th most air yards in the league. Those are all telling. Things are looking up for Jerry Jeudy, and I think you should do your best to get him in drafts this year. The last guy I want to talk about today, Elijah Moore. There's been so much hype surrounding Moore, but I think it's warranted. He's a very good wide receiver and a very good prospect. According to my prospect model, only Jamar Chase, who was a 99th percentile prospect, and Devontae Smith, who was a 98th percentile one, they were the only wide receivers who were better than Elijah Moore. Rashad Bateman was basically tied with Elijah Moore with a 96th percentile ranking. And I'm bringing that up because Elijah Moore was the 6th wide receiver drafted in the NFL draft. I don't view him as the 6th best wideout in this class, especially from a talent perspective. Now, I will admit, whenever I talked about Moore back during the draft process, one of the fears with him when he transitioned to the NFL was his ability to play more than just a slot role. According to Pro Football Focus, Moore had a slot snap rate of 78% during his final college season. Only 38 total snaps were against press coverage. It wasn't that he absolutely positively couldn't play a more traditional wide receiver role on the outside, that he couldn't play the perimeter. We just didn't know. And we still don't know. That brings more variance and pushes him down a rankings list. Now, some might view the Jets keeping Jamison Crowder as a really bad thing for Elijah Moore. And I'd agree with that. It makes Moore a slightly more volatile draft selection since, again, we don't really know if he can play the outside. We don't know if he can be a perimeter wide receiver. But you have to assume there's a reason that they're keeping Jamison Crowder. Moore has now started to play with the first team offense in camp, and he's playing on the outside. He's taking Keelan Cole's perimeter role. You got Corey Davis on the other side, and then Jamison Crowder in the slot. The Jets are very clearly trying to get Elijah Moore on the field. If they feel confident that he can play the perimeter, then we should feel more confident that he can too. I'm not saying it's a lock that he can. It's just evidence that he should be able to. That's a good thing because his production profile was out of control good coming out of school. This gets me so excited about his potential talent. He checks every box analytically, and now his team is throwing him all over the field to get reps. You can sit there and listen to me right now and say, I'm just following the hype. But there's more to this than just hype. Elijah Moore is a very talented wide receiver, and he should get an opportunity this year to showcase those skills. So those are the 10 guys. Those are the players I'm targeting most in fantasy drafts this year. Doesn't mean I don't like other players almost just as much. It just seemed right to give these players a shout. Now, if you like today's show, buckle up for next week's. I'm going to be going over players that I'm avoiding. But that's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you get subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'll talk to you later in the week with the mailbag episode.